Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event space. So, my name is Allie, and I'm your host for this evening. And I am so excited to be introducing Thea Prieto and Johanna Stoberock here to discuss Thea's new novella, From the Caves. But before we get into the good stuff, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. As much as we miss having you all in the bookstore, it has been such a delight to expand this online program to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and of course for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So I will be linking directly to books in chat all evening, so it'll be easy to go and find them. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in. All three of our locations are open. Or, of course, you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we, of course, do ship. And once again, we're so grateful for your support. While you're over on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up in the next few months. And if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update with events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. So we are here for about an hour, and at about the 45-minute mark, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or the bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. We'd love to know where you're from or your favorite latest read. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. But before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone of our commitment to ensuring the safety and well-being of event attendees and guest authors. So in our chat and question spaces, please do lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, there are auto-generated closed captions available from the top or the bottom of your screen. Select the live transcript button to enable or disable them. And I believe that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Thea Prieto, recipient of the Laurels Award Fellowship, as well as a finalist for the International Edwin L. Stockton Jr. Award and Glimmer Train's Short Story Award for New Writers. She writes and edits for poets and writers, and The Gravity of the Thing, and her work has appeared at Long Reads, New Orleans Review, Entropy, The Masters Review, and elsewhere. Her new novella, From the Caves, which won the Red Hen Novella Award, is about a family who retreats underground to escape the heat at the end of the world, where they depend on the stories of the dead to survive. In conversation tonight, I am so pleased to introduce Johanna Stoberock, the author of Pigs and City of Ghosts. She is the 2019 recipient of the Artist Trust Gar Lascelles Storyteller Award, 2016 runner-up for the Italo Calvino Prize for Fiction, and a 2012 Jack Straw Fellow, and has received residencies at the Corporation of Yaddo, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Malay Colony. Her work has appeared in the Chicago Review of Books, Lit Hub, the Best of the Net Anthology, and elsewhere. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, of course, give me a shout. I will be listening. Same goes for all of you in the audience. I will be in chat. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, both of you.
Hello, thank you. And I believe I'm going to start us off with a brief reading from my novella. And thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to give a special thank you to anyone listening in from Sonoma County, whether you're listening in now or you're watching the pre-recorded event later on. And a special thank you to the firefighters and neighbors with bulldozers and all the community members that were on phones and telephones and computers calling away a year ago Today's the 1-year anniversary of the Myers fire evacuation, and the house I grew up in would not be standing now if it wasn't for you. And instead, my family is watching in from that house. And so let's hear some of this story. I'm actually going to jump you all in right at chapter 4. And I think I might be mean and not give you all any context. One of the reasons I thought that we would jump in at chapter 4 today is because this is actually where I began writing the manuscript. There was lots of different manifestations of the story, but what most looked like a manuscript for From the Caves began right here. So let's start. Sky crouches in the deep and crowding dark. Blinking does not change the cave's blackness. Days of sleep have not weakened it. The small, painful lights no longer appear when he rubs his knuckles into his closed eyelids, so he grips the split floor of the cave. His fingers and toes dig into cracks worn smooth by bare feet, into the damp stones that suck warmth. At least he remembers their names. Hard, slippery. There are broken rocks as well. Sharp, dangerous. He thought he knew the words for darkness too, but without light, all talk has shrunk quiet. After so long in the lowest sleeping chamber, waiting out the storms and the choking heat of deep summer, it is not the usual dark of sleep or tunnel crawling. In the stillness, closed in by the smells of stale smoke and sour bodies, the blackness has grown. It pours into Sky's open eyes, widens inside of his ears. What used to be shallow, dormant breathing is now one large noise bouncing off the cave walls, and under the weight of the underground darkness, he cannot tell where the others are anymore. He cannot reach to them, and he cannot bring himself to speak to them. In the shadows, his loudest words are his oldest: thirsty, hungry, afraid. These words will not end the dark sickness. The pressure increases as noise grows in the tunnel, in the cave above. There is a dreamy shout from the main passageway that might be real, distant footsteps and wood planks dragging over loose gravel. Scrap. No, the word is scrape, scraping. When Sky unwraps his arms from around his narrow chest, the air in the cave swirls against his skin. Now he knows there will be fire and light. There will be shapes and figures and words pulled out of shadow, out of emptiness. His mouth waters. Footsteps draw closer and the dragging stops. Sky remains still, breathing and waiting. There is a thin scratching, the sound of wood scrubbing. The noise quickens. He licks his lips when he tastes the bitter smoke. A distant light opens, a swelling red in the cave above, and when Mark's stick of lit firewood bobs around the curve in the tunnel, Sky has to shield his eyes against the thudding brightness. "Come look," says Mark. "I found something." The sleeping breath around him breaks, a listening quiet. "Come see," says Mark, and the stabbing light retreats to the upper cave. Waking movements in the shadows. Sky drifts his hands into the dark and touches the cool skin of Ty's back. She has already lifted herself onto her hands and knees, but when he tries to help her stand, she throws his arm away. Clutching the wall of the tunnel, she climbs out of the sleeping chamber on her own, so Sky stretches his fingers into the blackness to find Teller. He feels the burning in the air before he feels Teller's hot and sticky face, his shaking limbs. Teller has managed to turn himself onto his side, but it is Sky who rolls him onto his stomach so he can crawl. "Ready?" whispers Sky when Teller has lifted himself. 1, 2, 3. With his arms wrapped around Teller's middle, Sky heaves him a step forward. Teller groans, readjusts his arms and knees under his body, and Sky heaves again. Though Sky was to conserve his energy with sleep, to slow his heartbeat and tighten his breath into a small, hungerless lump in his stomach, he is quickly exhausted, his parched throat sucking hoarse. He rests frequently, listening to Teller gasp, and by the time they reach the cave above, Mark's low fire is already too hot to sit near. There are pots of drinking water and wash water resting in the coals, as well as carefully cropped roots warming, a collection of clean water jars ready to be filled, a small heap of sandy wood chips, all Mark's work. The smoke drags upward into the main passageway, which is nighttime dark, and Mark and Ty rest at the cooler end of the cave, their heads bowed to a shape between them, a large and orb-like object. Sky manages to heave Teller one last time before Teller collapses flat onto his side, bloodless and panting. He drags hissing air through his clamped jaw, but even as his muscles gather into knots and contract his knees into the air, sound pushes through his gritted teeth. Water, hisses Teller. Mark looks up from the round object, his sun-blistered forehead crossed over flared and sleepless eyes. I just started the water. How many hands do you think I have? Says Mark. If I have to do everything while everyone else does nothing, then you're going to have to wait. The word nothing rings through Sky's bones, stinging the cores of his eyes, the stem of his voiceless tongue. Days and nights in the suffocating sleeping chamber, saturated in a pooling bodily stench as the other two slept, his mind growing wordless but always quicker, always nervous, in that scream of dangerous memories, that deep underground quiet, a silence broken only by Teller's groans and spasms and yelps, dripping water into Teller's mouth as his teeth snapped, forced to wash Ty where she could not reach, wiping them both low and between their legs like the others used to bathe him as a child. Like babies, he kept telling his inept and frightened hands, bathe them like children. But nothing, nothing. Mark thinks I am nothing. He told me to stay with Ty and Teller. He told me to keep them fed and washed and empty their buckets when Mark looked for firewood and took care of the food and water, and I only tried to please you, my brother, but I am nothing in the dark, nothing in nothingness. Sky's face burns, and when he stands to rush away, his knees wobble. The effort to move Teller drops Sky's blood into his feet, flattening his drained body against the floor of the cave. His throat grates as air pulls deep into his chest. One breath, 2, 3, and gradually his vision becomes steadier, his thoughts more clear. The dark sickness eases. I'm going to stop there.
Wow, thank you so much. It was really amazing. I just wanted to start by saying congratulations to you. I know your book has been out for about a week now, and I read it about a month ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and thinking about the incredible precision of the prose, and hearing you read it just makes that precision all the more clear. But also thinking about the world and the kind of personal terror that reading about this world invokes for me, but also the kind of hope and resilience that you've also written into that world. And I guess one of the questions that I had, and you sort of brought it up a little bit, is where just curious about where it started for you. It sounds like the fourth chapter was where your writing of it started, and I'm just curious about how that happened, whether you knew what you were writing when you started.
I feel like if I had known what I was doing, I probably would have done it very different and probably saved myself some time. But I think that the process of writing this manuscript shows a lot of, it showed me a lot of how I come to writing and what I find to be inspiring. Because it definitely didn't come together chronologically. It was all these different parts that kind of gravitated to each other. The oldest pieces of the manuscript are definitely the stories within stories. All the creation myths, and many of them I can never take credit for. They are older than, many different civilizations, and I was simply collecting them and putting them in common space, looking at how they overlapped and how the patterns might line up. And some of those stories were quite long, and many of them are completely unrecognizable now in From the Caves. They kind of got repurposed for this different story. And And that's mostly because I think from that very beginning, it was just these kind of orbiting stories. And then when the storytelling characters and their cave at the end of the world occurred to me, that's kind of when I started to get another lens on the story and begin to kind of think about my perspective and how I might approach these stories. And my first thought was that these characters in their cave could never leave the cave, that they were kind of blinking into existence in darkness, and the stories would slowly become their way out of the cave, if not physically, then through their storytelling. And that's kind of where chapter 4 begins, where the reading I just shared, where we're kind of just in Sky's perspective, blinking awake and trying to just get a sense of touch, feel, sound, smell. And I think that chapter 1 came about hugely because of some very helpful workshops at PSU, but also out in the community with family, at Tin House, but also talking with friends and family about something completely unrelated. There was a lot of ways that I kind of came around to realize that with people asking the right questions, that the characters had to get out of the cave. There was more to see, there was more to explore, and them being trapped in the cave wasn't necessarily going to be the most fruitful experiment. And so, getting to a point where I was able to discover chapter 1 and Green's death in that opening paragraph, that's actually one of the earliest, most recent additions to the manuscript. So in a way, I kind of cluttered all of these different pieces together and then worked my way backwards. Beginnings are very tricky for me. So I would say that's still the most raw writing in the entire manuscript. Yes, and how about you? I was just finishing up your book Pigs this week, and I feel like there's so much of the manuscript there. It almost feels like all of these pieces, and the same way all of the children on their island are collecting the world's garbage, and there's all these pieces, and the closer that some of it gets examined, it's not garbage at all. There's these, it says more about, the world and what it deems to be garbage versus treasure. And I felt like Pigs is almost this collage of these treasures. And I'd be very curious to know how all the parts came together to make that manuscript.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It started just with the first paragraph, and it was really interesting for me to hear that that the seed from the caves is kind of in the central part of it. For me, it's really hard for me to start something without a beginning, and so I just kind of woke up one day and, like, that first sentence of it, "The pigs ate everything," was just there for me, and I just started writing from that. But the longer I was working on it, and the primary narrative of it is about these 4 children who live on an island where they collect all of the entire world's garbage and feed it to a herd of garbage-eating pigs. But the more, and so that was like a thread that was pretty easy and interesting for me to follow. But the more that I wrote about it, the more it kind of expanded about things that I wanted to think about, and kind of writing experiments that I wanted to just try out. And so throughout the novel, there are these tiny little interstitial chapters that are just about, about looking at the island from a distance, and also about the things that that we throw away. And like you said, part of the experiment there was to think about, can we enfold these things that we throw away as beautiful? Can we enfold them and love them? And so there's like a lot of them have lists about things that I just really love, like spools of film that we don't know how to process anymore, or chipped teacups, or whatever it is, like just garbage that we throw away. And so I think that you're right, like the narrative of the novel was clear and progressing, but all the little pieces that kind of provide structure for it, it was more of a collage. And I did use them also for reasons of pacing too. But so one of the things that really stood out to me so strongly was how vivid From the Caves is, but it's not always vivid, visually vivid, right? I mean, it is visually vivid, but it takes place often in darkness. But the world is really tactile, and we feel it, we understand it spatially, etc. And I just was curious about whether you had to stretch kind of new muscles in order to make a world that is often dark really vivid for your readers.
It was definitely a challenge. I'm lucky that I had a lot of people in my writing community that were avidly reading about different narratives that maybe involved a human being that, you know, couldn't, I'm thinking about Jose Saramago's Blindness in particular was a very useful text. Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, there's a scene in there where a prisoner is in a deep cell and they can't see anything. And there's so many bodies crowded into this dark cell, and just these bits of sound, these smells that are coming from it, all of the other senses, they get perked in these very strong and visceral ways. I thought that scene in particular in The Power and the Glory was very useful. But getting back to Jose Saramago's Blindness, the way that dialogue is handled in that story, where, and in case people in the audience haven't read it, and so in Blindness, a blindness like a plague comes across this city, and for apparently no reason, people are struck blind, and it's specifically a blindness that makes them see white. And as the main character and the other characters all lose the ability to see, so does the writing do really fascinating things, especially when it comes to dialogue. We don't get your typical, or at least traditionally, conventionally structured dialogue where you have the paragraph break and every new speaker is indicated with that white space. It all starts to kind of scroll together. Punctuation has to be handled very differently in that sense. And I found that to be hugely inspirational and so true to at least what I perceive as, you know, as a seeing person, to be like more of a maybe more of a interesting way to think of narrative, not in this, you know, this way that uses, you know, blank page and black text, but rather it made me more aware of rhythms. It made me more aware of how the pacing, as you mentioned before in your story. And I think that this experiment writing From the Caves, especially because I wanted to do away with a lot of punctuation, I wanted it to be very stripped down, that getting into writing about the caves and constructing dialogue also in this story became very much a practice in rhythms, and leaning into that confined space of the cave and remembering not to leave it while I was writing, I thought was very helpful and an interesting practice while this manuscript came to be.
That's interesting. Does it bear a resemblance to your other work, or does it feel like a departure for you?
Good question. I mean, all of my fiction tends to be pretty dark and experimental, but then all my nonfiction tends to be, you know, very realistic and quiet in a way. And so it's interesting I think it's less different than the fiction I write, but very different than the nonfiction I write. And so, and I'm still kind of experimenting with different ways that my writing practice could go. Seems like I could just as easily drop myself into another larger project that's nonfiction and quiet and could be a very interesting self-exploration and going inward. Or I've been reading a lot of, you know, sci-fi these days, and the enormous worlds that can be built. I could just as soon go extremely, you know, lean into my fiction and just start creating, you know, entire cityscapes if I wanted to go that direction. So not quite sure what that next project's going to be, if I'm going to lean in or lean out, but it's going to happen. How about you? Are you working on anything these days?
You know, I'm a really slow writer. I'm working on a novel, and I keep feeling like, oh, I'll have a good draft of it soon, but it's slow. And I guess I just I was commissioned to write a story for Washington Humanities, and I just am finishing up it now. And the prompt for the story was together again, and it has been sort of interesting for me because it's made me realize that I'm really interested in kind of like collective voices, and there's definitely a lot of that in pigs. But I kind of hadn't realized that it was a particular interest of mine, just like the we voice, the kind of voice of the group rather than the voice of the individual. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot.
Nice.
Yeah, so and that kind of like I'm really curious about the community that you created within From the Caves. The story, I mean, you limit, it's limited to Sky, right? The narrating voice is limited to the character of Sky. And I guess I was curious about, I mean, I'm curious about a lot of things with it. Like, I'm curious about whether you're super, super close into him as a narrator, and whether that's something that you've experimented with before, like that super, super close in third person voice. And then I guess I was also really curious about whether you knew always from the beginning that the story, although it's the story of a collective of people, it's a story that is really Sky's story. And just kind of curious about what the process was, both of coming up with a narrative voice and then also with homing in on Sky.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to speak to that. Although even now that it's out in the world, I still wonder about all the things I could have done differently with point of view and perspective, because the lensing on this story was pretty difficult. Not just because we have stories within stories, but we also have Sky's perspective that is mostly third person, but also in emotional moments will break through to first person. And that was kind of a compromise, I think, between an idea that, you know, I'm talking in workshop, there were some ideas about what if I tried an authorial omniscient? What would it mean to have access to different characters and maybe be able to even have a perspective that scoped back and commented upon the world? And I think the reason I didn't end up doing this, one, because I find it personally extremely difficult to write that way. And I'm nothing but, you know, I'm nothing but impressed by authors that are able to do that. And in pigs, being able to work that omniscience and that different psychic distance, it's something that I find difficult to do. Another reason I didn't end up doing it is I suspected that the same way the cave is working as this kind of pressurized, like claustrophobic chamber, that the whole story, I was kind of using that pressure and that claustrophobia to kind of turn it into kinetic energy and drive the story forward. I thought that by stepping into many different bodies, or to be able to step back and deliver information when a part of that pressure is the lack of resources and the lack of information, that would almost work like a pressure release valve for the tension. And I kind of wanted to keep that compression going and keep the kinetic energy going, going forward. And so I ended up, you know, backing away from the authorial omniscient. I think the compromise was that oscillation between the third and the first, so that there was a backing off, that I didn't always have to be kind of stuck in Sky's, you know, as a child who's still coming to language and is curious, there's a kind of limitation on the vocabulary, punctuation, expression. And so I didn't want, you know, to back up all the way so that, you know, every metaphor and word was then available. But it did give a little bit of breathing room. And inevitably, the choice to go with Sky, I think, is because he was such a learning character and I was learning about the manuscript and the story. Also because I was learning about my own grief over loved ones at the time. I heard a lot of really good writing advice while I was writing this manuscript, but probably top 10 was this visiting writer at PSU, and he mentioned something about his writing process, and I remember it stuck with me. He was talking about how he was writing a piece and had, stumbled across writer's block and didn't know how to move forward. And specifically, he was working on a piece where his main character went into a culture that, although the writer was extremely interested in and very inspired to write about this culture, felt that because he was going into this culture and writing about it, that he feared misrepresenting anybody, and felt that it wasn't quite his place to go in and try these representations. And so after sitting there with writer's block for a while, he thought, well, you know what? Maybe the point isn't to solve this, but rather to put this problem on the page. Maybe this is one of the central questions of it, and it should be addressed rather than try to step around it. And so what he did is he made, and this is the thing I always remember, he made his writer problem the character problem. Instead, the character became very aware of their place in society and started questioning. And in that way, the writer got around his writer's block, but also was able to really address some of, I think, some very human concerns and some bigger concerns that maybe would have been approached otherwise. So bringing it back around from the caves, as I was going through, some different cases of personal grief, I remember wondering about writing and about stories and their use. Like, what are these flimsy things I was telling myself in the face of this loss? That what, in this void of this person left behind, how many stories can you throw into it to fill the void and it'll be better? And the answer is there's no way. And I know now that stories kind of serve a different purpose than that. But at the time, I kind of made that question: what are stories good for? Whatever that question is, that kind of became, I let that be Sky's problem. I let that be my character's problem to work out at the end of the world when they're starving and thirsty, and they have this other thing, this writing on the wall and these stories. Like, what are these good for when this is going on? And so this is a long and a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think that the reason I ended up going with Sky is not just because he was a learning character and I got to learn through him. And I think that for a reader learning how to read from the caves, that's also a good guide. But I think that I was trying to work out some of my own big questions, and Sky seemed like a natural person to also be figuring out those big questions about storytelling and what do they mean, what are their use, what good are they in his kind of life. Right, and so there was a lot of, I think the psychic distance of telescoping in and out had a lot to do with that experiment. I wonder, and you mentioned earlier that in Pigs, there's that telescoping back and forth between the characters on the island, but then also this zooming back and looking at the island from this almost like allegorical, distance. The psychic distance is so zoomed out. And then of course it zooms all the way back in, and here we are on the island, and these children are with very real bodies and in very real danger, and there's nothing very allegorical about the bodily harm that is being inflicted on them. It kind of reminded me at times like of an extreme version of that oscillation between Sky's third and first, where there's this distance and then it collapses in. What was it like discovering that collective consciousness and also that manipulation of that omniscience?
Yeah, what was it like? It was really freeing. I had never written an omniscient voice before, and I guess I had been reading a lot of Kafka for a number of years, and I got super interested in the way that he kind of does that, where like he's right there with the characters, and then all of a sudden his narrator just kind of like stops back and is sort of like treats the characters in a kind of toxic way. And I got really interested in, like there's so many questions about power within pigs. The children are like, they have no power at all. They're, victims to these ridiculous grown-ups on the island and what have you. But I got super interested in the idea that like the teller of the story is a kind of toxic power as well. That characters can become victim to the voice that is telling their story. And it hadn't really ever occurred to me before, and kind of discovering that and experimenting with it was very freeing for me. Yeah. And it kind of opened up all of these things. Like, some people talk about, novels are just like giant expandable bags that you can kind of throw anything into. And I kind of knew that, but I had never really felt the freedom of that before, where it's like, okay, if I want to have a chapter that's just a list, I can do that. I can set up the rules for this world. And that was a pleasure to discover.
I felt that way with some of the maybe more mechanical choices from the caves, with like choosing the present tense or choosing, I was kind of struggling with the point of view, but inevitably going like, you know what, I'm just going to do third and first, that's what we're going to do for this experiment. The present tense was definitely, it was something that I remember writing a couple of sentences I'd only been writing in past tense, or kind of a storytelling kind of past tense for a long time. And so this was one of my first experiments of just going straight, like on the ground, looking through the eyes of someone who's experiencing in that moment, kind of present tense. And it felt weird at first, but I thought like, I'm just going to keep going with it and see what happens. And I was really inspired by a story that was, it was a short story that had come through a journal I was editing at the time. And it was a story, it was written by a woman. She was writing first person present tense, and she was writing about a PTSD episode that was happening. And what was fascinating is that the present tense continued even when the flashback was happening. And I thought, how perfect of a decision, how wise that this isn't like a remembering, a dropping back into past tense to go to this traumatic moment. This person's experiencing it as though we are picking up and continuing on the ground straight forward. And to see that present tense could do something like that, that it could so, I think, aptly show what a human is experiencing in their skin, or even the nature of memory or the nature of trauma, I thought was like that. It was very deft move and very wise. And so I thought that I know that my characters are going to go through some trauma. Maybe I can do something similar with this present tense. And there were some times when, because I was like, it's my book, I can do whatever I want, I would wiggle out into past tense, and sometimes just to draft and get the chapters down. But inevitably I would go back and be like, it doesn't have that, maybe that kinetic force I was mentioning earlier, that drive. And so they ended up getting shifted over to present tense inevitably. I love that experimenting part of it, that letting it kind of bubble out of whatever form had started to take shape, and then either realizing, meh, and then bringing it back to the form it was going in, or being like, no, actually that was the right way, and then letting it, the whole thing follow suit. It's definitely a fun experiment.
It sounds like it. It looks like there's a question from Heather, which is, was it hard to leave the characters when you finished writing the book, or do you think you'll ever revisit them?
It's a good question. There's definitely some, I've never been very good at goodbyes. And so the fact that it's wrapping up at least in this form, is kind of, there is a kind of a farewell there. I don't feel myself going back to him, not positive. Maybe it's because I felt like Sky's arc had kind of, it had continued its path the way I had envisioned and imagined my characters would, with what they knew when I left them in chapter 9, would continue on in the way that they knew how. And so I don't feel like a return to them, but I also don't know if that's because sometimes writing those last chapters were some of the like emotionally draining and technically difficult of the entire manuscript. Even if I kind of knew where I was going with those last chapters and had a blueprint, there was something that was like pulling teeth to get those chapters down. Maybe it was also because it was so difficult for the characters, but also I think there's something about holding an entire manuscript and trying to keep, almost like juggling, where in the first chapter you get 3 balls, and by the 4th maybe you drop 1, but then there's 5 balls, and then there's 6. So by the last chapters as a writer, sometimes I felt like I've got 15 balls in the air, and like, how am I even supposed to write one paragraph without like getting, this whole thing is going to come cascading down. And so that sensation of knowing I had reached the end it felt right. There was definitely a lot of editing that went into it. It was also like, and the balls all dropped, and I was like, good, like just, it's done, in a sense. And so Heather, asked me again in like another couple of years. Maybe I'll miss them badly, but right now I'm like, go free, characters. It's your time.
How long was your writing process for it? When did you start it and when did you finish it?
That's a good question. I think chapter 4, when I sat down to write what is a recognizable chapter 4 to finishing it, I'd say probably 4 years, something like that, 4 or 5. But some of those creation myths that I've been playing with those. Some of them I learned about when I was a kid and loved them so much that they would work their way into early pieces of my writing. Some stories that I begin to collage together and manipulate, they've been around since I was a teenager. And so I say as a recognizable manuscript, 4 or 5 years, but there's definitely pieces in here that are much older.
Did you have the experience of the world catching up to your fictionalized world as you were writing it? I mean, fire has become such a more common present every year. And I mean, I guess I'm just curious about whether it felt like the world was moving to match the world that you were creating.
There have definitely been moments, horrifying moments, where I see that blinking, that very quick shimmer of reflection between the two. The most obvious would be after the Myers fire, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this event, today's the 1-year anniversary of the evacuation. And the fire got within 50 feet of my family's house, and no closer, thank God, because of the community. But for a long time, there was this burnt line out in the fields outside of our house. And it was this very strange thing, not only the fear of how close it got to the house that me and my family built and love, but that also it was like the world I'd been writing had somehow crept up, and that on one side was this blackened, unrecognizable world, and on the other side was the sunny, flowering world I've known my entire life. And to see them that close was quite terrifying. And I'll never forget that. There's not a lot you can do to forget 3,000 blackened acres that used to, maybe I even took it for granted. This beautiful fabric that defines home for me was suddenly changed. But even as I'm saying, I'll never forget it, there's also, it must be said, there within a month, the whole burn zone was covered in these tiny little fluorescent green grass sprigs. And that spring, there were wildflowers, and it doesn't mean it goes away, but it makes me think about the resiliency of the earth and also people. The community out there, because of the Myers fire, have always been in conversation and worked together, but so much this last year, getting ready for this year's fire season, everyone has been working together and very working very hard and communicating in new and different ways to work together. And I think that a lot of From the Caves might have been an exploration, at the very essence of it, an exploration of that resiliency that I wanted to, at the end of the world, with these characters, kind of lean on them and see, when they're under this pressure, what breaks and what holds up under that pressure. And there was a lot to fear when the Myers fire was happening, but there was also a lot of comfort to see how much held up, especially in the community. So a lot to think about. Definitely this world that we're living in now gets me thinking about my writing practice and the things I wrote about in From the Caves.
Yeah, one of the things that was so moving for me about reading it was just how the characters seemed pulled towards kindness over and over. I mean, even within the frustration and the anger and the fear, that always this idea of human kindness was something that was deep inside of them, and it was just something that was very, very moving about it. I guess I'm curious about. I mean, this is a big and hard question, and so do with it what you want. But I guess I'm curious about what you hope readers will leave it thinking about.
Yes, I think a sense of authorship, and that could be in terms of storytelling, but it could also be in the world we live in our landscapes, in our lives, or at least an awareness of that authorship. I think that there's so much about our past that in the way we hold our past, the way we remember it through stories or in other different ways, that shows what we have the capacity to remember and learn from, and also what we can fail to learn from. And I think all of that we carry into the present, and inevitably how we hold those stories and hold our past in this present will dictate what we bring into the future and what we can look forward to, if anything. Or, it could be this wonderful thing to look forward to. It could be something else entirely. And so I hope that people take from the Caves a sense of authorship in their own lives, in what they choose to remember, what they choose to learn from, what they strive to remember and learn from, and to bring that with them and carry it forward into their lives and into landscapes as well.
I think that seems like a really great thing to hope for your readers.
Absolutely. And how about you? I'm still floating in pigs and thinking about the end of that story, the children and the garbage and the relationship with the pigs. What's a takeaway there that I'd be curious to know? I have my own takeaways, but I'm curious to know what your goals were there.
I guess there are a lot of things that I hope readers think about. I mean, one of the things that really was propelling me was just thinking about the things that we were losing without recognizing that they were being lost. When I started writing, I think when I first started writing it, there was the question of, whether birth control would be covered under the Affordable Care Act, and just thinking about what freedoms are lost when access to birth control is no longer as easy. So things like that, right? So all of these things that seem like they're just small changes that cascade to become really enormous things that we lose. And so hoping that it would be an occasion for readers to be spend a little time mindfully thinking about things that we throw away, that we take for granted, but that actually just get thrown away. And then I guess I started thinking about, you know, the systems of the world that we set up that are really toxic systems, that are systems that allow, you know, a large and privileged portion of the world to not look at the results of the decisions that are made, and that those are put in place in a systematic way that allow the privileged part of the world to ignore what it's doing. And so that was a big part of what I was thinking about while I was writing, and that I hope that readers will think about also. But I guess I'm just, as I was writing it, and I was writing about all of this loss and all of the systemic failures that are present within the world, I just also got really reminded of the incredible beauty of the world. And I hope that that is something that readers are able to come away with as well, just the beauty of the details of the world, that when we look at the world very, very closely, we can see both the problems that are present in it, but also the beauty of detail and the beauty of precision. So.
And the looking at it, I think, is part of that transformation too, not just to see the beauty in it, but to no longer ignore it and let it mound up behind. And so I think that's wonderful. And the whole book, I think, is a practice in looking at it and seeing what's happening. And I think that's important. And I think that kind of narrative has grown imperative to look at it. And I think artists play a good part in that kind of in that communal decision to look at it. And I think, I mean, post-apocalyptic fiction can very much, you know, it falls under the category of science fiction. And so it can often, science fiction can often be, or fantasy, be relegated to this thing that doesn't exist. It's this, you know, fantasy escapism. And I'm not the first one to say this, so many writers have said that's too simple. There's so much that fiction, that despite it might not be, a concrete reality that's being described there. There's a truth there, and I think it contributes to our communal, conversation about what does it mean to have, garbage mounting or privilege mounting the way it is, to look at environmental crises in a new way, in a diligent way, in an unflinching, unblinking way. We need to look at this and keep going. Yeah, so thank you for pigs for that reason.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think we have about 5 more minutes together, and I want to make sure that if anybody who is here listening, whether anybody has any questions that they want to put in the Q&A or in the chat for Thea.
Yeah, otherwise we'll wrap it up just a touch early, but of course, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to field them.
How about, to give them a second, can I ask a question? So for both of you, was there a trail of books that led you to writing the books that you most recently wrote?
Oh, good question. There's a couple books that blink to mind. And I know I've mentioned Megan Hunter's The End We Start From before. I'm trying to think of a new one. I'd mentioned Blindness. I'm not sure if it read to From the Caves, but definitely led me to writing is Calvino's Invisible Cities. It was this, I'd only read a couple little excerpts out of it. It's a book that's mostly composed of flash fictions that describe in a paragraph different cities that could all be the same city, they could all be different cities. And I grew up in California, but I would come up to Portland every now and then, usually because of a heartbreak, and I would go to Powell's and I'd pick up Calvino's Invisible Cities. I would read a couple of them and go, I'm good now. And I'd put it back And I would come back, months or years later when I needed that breath again and read a couple more. And so it took me a long time to read this book that I absolutely loved, mostly because it was like my secret weapon. Like if something was going wrong, I didn't know what else to do, I'd come up to Portland. And so when I decided to go back to writing and study writing, I only applied to go to school here in Portland because of that book in a lot of ways, because of a lot of people as well, and Portland being what it is. But if there's a book that led me to this writing project, it would probably be that one, that it kept drawing me back to this city where I would eventually write the manuscript.
That's such a beautiful story.
It's a beautiful book too. I highly recommend to everybody.
Yeah. I guess for me, I mentioned it earlier also, Kafka's Metamorphosis was really influential. I teach at Whitman College, and I teach in a first-year program. It doesn't exist in the same way anymore, but a lot of the texts, the books that we taught in that course made their way into Pigs. So the most obvious is the Odyssey. And for a long time, I kind of was like trying to understand the island as another island that maybe Odysseus just missed while he was traveling. But also Plato's Symposium, which is, about love and beauty, was a big part of it. And I guess I was also reading Borges a lot while I was writing, so there was that in it too. I am kind of a fairy tale junkie, and I think that the kind of the rhythms and qualities of fairy tales and the kind of flatness of those stories, like the flat, kind of rich flatness of them is a big part of the way that I approach writing. Yeah, so those are some of them.
Nice.
Yeah.
I got sort of lost, but we got most of the books. Some of the books are on the list. So we are just about at the end of our evening. So this is our official last call for questions. But my last question will be, what is on the horizon for each of you? What's coming next, if you're allowed to talk about it?
No huge projects at this moment. I'm still kind of deciding what direction I'll go. Although I've been really into the idea of building recently. I'm not sure if this kind of correlates to writing practice. I think it does. I think that there's something about writing a book that I know I lived in it for so many years, and I wrote this thing that I hope my family and friends and people can live in this story. Even if for a brief time in this novella. And so I'm kind of getting into the idea of like, what if I want to build like a greenhouse or something else that someone can live in and be part of. And so it's kind of, it's not writing, but it kind of comes from the same impulse that I want to, I want to build something and be an inhabitant of it for a while. Maybe I'll do that before I go on to write another fiction. Until then, I think I've got a number of articles on the horizon. How about you?
Well, I'm working on a novel. I'm working on like a couple different novels. I'm trying to figure out which is the right one. But I really want, there's a project that I've been working on that is about, family histories that I am probably feel most connected to. And then I guess I just have been, I don't know, trying to write these like really small, very small stories also. So yeah. But a greenhouse sounds like a really great to be built.
Yes,
I was going to say, what a good answer. So it is about time for us to call it a night. So I'm going to just take this last moment to say thank you for all of you who came and participated. And of course, for our wonderful authors this evening, thank you for this conversation. It has been a delight. For everyone who would like to get your hands on a copy of From the Caves or Pigs, I'm going to link them in chat one more time so it's easy. You don't have to scroll. Go ahead and follow those links or come on in. We would love to see you, of course. If you're not local, tweet us, hit us online. We'd love to hear from you always. And Thea and Johanna, one more huge thank you from all of us, I think. And with that, it's time for us to awkwardly wave and say goodnight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allie. Thank you, Johanna. It was wonderful. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Great.